Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand. Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship.
Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the History of the Atlantic World. My name is Jesse Wiest. Thank you for joining us, and I really do mean us for this bonus episode. What follows is an interview I conducted with Dr. Chris Ferguson, a PhD in psychology who is a professor at Stetson University. He is the author of a few books. One of them is Moral Combat, which is his take on why the war on violent video games is wrong. Another is a fiction novel set in Renaissance Florence called Suicide Kings. But the reason I'm talking to Dr. Ferguson is he just finished up a new book that was recently published called How Madness Shaped History. And let me tell you, it is delightful. If you're looking for a good book to read, especially in these crazy coronavirus times, if you're listening to this in April of 2020, you might need something to do. How Madness Shaped History is a really, really great book. I just want to say that. Now, I enjoyed doing this interview a lot. I've got a few more lined up over the next few months. I'm going to release them as bonus episodes. If you guys enjoy them enough, I might eventually collect them into a separate kind of spin-off show. I don't know. But at any rate, the next episode of the main show, Conquest of the Americas Part 4, is I'm recording that today as well. So you might actually be able to listen to that episode at the exact same time that you find this episode, or if not, then a few hours later. Anyway, one other thing, if you happen to enjoy interviews like this, I'd like to introduce you to a great show put out with Big Heads Media, who we are a partner with. It's called Her American Story. Her American Story is a great show, basically where first and second generation American women just get to tell their story. It's a lot of fun. Here's a quick promo for that show.
Do you love a good story? Her American Story is a podcast for anyone who loves a good story. First and second generation American women share their American experience. Sharing our stories helps us to relate to one another, build understanding, as well as provide representation for those that need it most. I grew up in a smaller American town and lacked representation in my community and simply in media at that time. I created something I wanted to hear. I hope this podcast reaches those that need it most, as well as serves as a collection of simply interesting stories. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter at HerAMStory. Everyone has the story. Share yours with me. Email me at heramericanstory@gmail.com.
Here with you today. It's really, I'm really glad to talk to you. I loved your book, How Madness Shaped History. I literally could not put it down. And
I super glued the cover. That's why.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very the title draws you. But I have to say, I think you're a really humorous writer for someone writing about nonfiction. I would like to pay you that compliment before we start talking, I guess.
Cool.
There's plenty of history books that don't give you that feeling of wanting to keep going and going and going. I can tell you that. But anyway, I just start with a simple question, I guess. Why don't you tell everybody listening what the book is about?
Sure. Yeah. So that's a great question. So yeah, it's pretty much what it says on the box. Essentially, it's not a big mystery. So, it's how madness shaped history. So I really was kind of curious. So, well, what basically happened is, I've read a few of these books like Guns, Germs, and Steel. And what's the other one by Ian Morris there? Like why the West rules and this kind of stuff. So there are a few books that I've read out there that make the argument. I think do a really good job of making the argument that history to a large degree is shaped by things like geography, so the luck of where you happen to live, plays a role. And so the argument is, of course, Europeans had access to horses and people in Central and South America didn't. And that's kind of like one factor that plays a role in why European nations sort of rose to this massive prominence during the Enlightenment period, and like the Aztecs or the Incas didn't, even though they had very sophisticated societies that they developed. And I think that's a persuasive argument, but I kind of felt like that left out this sort of element that like sometimes individuals really do matter, that there are these like crisis points, that societies can hit when they need to kind of like make decisions fast. And what can happen is they can either get someone who's got kind of a level head, and that can result in one path. It might not always be the right path, but oftentimes it is. Or they can have someone who really has some psychological issues, and they can kind of roll the dice, if you will, on that. And sometimes you can get someone who's kind of brilliant, who may have psychological issues, but still is like the right person at the moment. More often you get disaster on the other hand. So it was interesting to look at different periods in history and look at certain particular individuals who occupied unique spaces in history and what they did with those spaces. And and there are exceptions. We can think of a few, but for the most part, they sort of ended up being a sort of fulcrum for a decline, whether quickly or slowly, for the society that they were, making decisions for. So really the book was kind of focused on this, as these kind of like lurid, interesting stories about, mad women and mad men, and how they ended up, in most cases, doing some damage to the societies that they were leading.
Oh yeah, and I have to say you talk about a lot of different examples, and some of them I have to say I'm a huge fan of history, but obviously history is everything that ever happened all over the place. So there's always so many things to learn, and some of the stories in there are just were kind of eye-opening, especially for me. And that the ancient history stuff is not something that I'm particularly well versed in. And I can't remember the name of the war. Was it the Peloponnesian War? I guess or the Greek. That was great. But before we go into any further, I am interested, and I think some of the listeners might be interested too, about someone who is a psychologist, a professor of psychology, and then writes a history book. How did that? What made you decide to write the book? I guess, or how did that come about?
That's a great question. So, I think part of it is I'm already, I'm a forensic psychologist, actually. So I'm already kind of, part of my interest in psychology was already being kind of drawn to the dark side.
Yeah.
So, and of course, among the sort of historical figures in the book, there are a certain number of serial killers and mass murderers who make appearances here and there in the book. Some of them are politicians, some of them are just not, So that's an interesting group of people as well. So I was already kind of used to writing about sort of like darkness as well. And I got kind of curious again, sort of like looking back of not just people. I sort of used to write like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer and figures like that, kind of like serial killers and, people in recent, history that people are aware of. And of course, Hitler and Stalin and all that kind of people. But I want to kind of look back and look at like look at the Roman Empire and like what did people like Caligula and Elagabalus and like that do to the Roman Empire, and what different track might it have taken if it had gotten someone, a bit more stable, if you will, during some of the, periods it had to face. So I was kind of looking at like what are the sort of similarities of different individuals, throughout history. And of course, it's always kind of tricky to sort of like diagnose people who lived like 2,000 years ago and that kind of stuff. And
right, yeah,
careful point in the book. But it still is kind of fascinating to look at, like, are there like certain common threads that run through some of these individuals? Are there some differences that run through some of these individuals? And what can we take from history to learn about like today and how we make decisions today and the political issues we're having today and the psychological issues we're having today? And how can we try to not repeat, some of the mistakes of the past, if you will?
Well, absolutely. That's a really good point. And I want to get into one thing you specifically talk about in the book, especially since we're going to talk about what to look out for. I think the chief thing you want to look out for is you talk about your Hitlers and your Stalins and your Maos, and they seem to have something that you and I'd say researchers call the dark triad of personality disorders. And so I guess if we're going to really look out for anything, we should probably look out for the dark triad. And what is the dark triad? I know you get into this into the book, but briefly, just so what is that?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of psychological research on this concept of the dark triad, which has got a great name, by the way. So
it's really neat. Yeah, it's a very interesting sounding concept.
Yeah, you have this like excellent name that the general public can grab onto. That's how you become like a famous psychologist. But that's not my idea. Actually, other people.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry. I knew that wasn't. And I remember as soon as I said that, I was like, no, I remember reading. He made it clear that was somebody else's name. But anyhow, sorry.
So it's really three personality characteristics that none of them are good, but you sort of like combine them together. Well, I mean, two of them are definitely not good. One might not be terrible, but you combine the three together and you really end up with a lot of problems. And the one is antisocial personality disorder, which is your standard psychopath or sociopath. There's really not much distinction in those terms, but basically someone who lacks empathy and takes advantage of others and doesn't feel guilty for the things that they do that is wrong. And you combine that. So the fun thing about antisocial people, by the way, is they're actually, people kind of like hear the term and they assume that antisocial means that they don't like people. That's not true at all. I mean, people who are have antisocial personality disorder tend to be very outgoing. In fact, it's just that their social connections are used to manipulate and take advantage of others. Then the second you have is narcissistic personality disorder, which probably most people can get a sense of what it is from the name, but it's a sense that you're better than most other people, that you have unique talents that other people don't have, that you should be given more rights than other people should enjoy. So basically sort of putting yourself as being more important than other people and thinking of yourself as being better than other people. And the third is something called Machiavellianism, which, of course, is named after the Italian philosopher Stetson. And the idea that's the least bad of the three. I mean, again, a sort of moderate dose of Machiavellianism isn't necessarily terrible, but it's basically a kind of like cynical, strategic, political approach to things, like calculating how to make decisions so they maximize your benefit and maybe not necessarily the benefit of other people. So it doesn't really have the full-blood harshness of antisocial, but there still is that kind of like means, or the ends justify the means, kind of mentality. It's not really concerned with ethics or morality. It's really about strategy. You're trying to get to a particular strategic goal and pragmatically what things you need to get to that goal without worrying about the ethics or morality of the things that you're doing. So if you can put the three together and you have someone who doesn't have a conscience, essentially, who thinks they're better than everybody else, and is willing to strategically try to get to their goals without worrying about morality or ethics, you can end up with a pretty dangerous combination of individuals. Now, there probably are plenty of people out there that are like that, like, in certain careers like business, law, politics, that aren't necessarily disasters, but,
yeah.
Now that we've had, particular issues with, at least seem to fit, that particular diagnosis. It's not really a diagnosis, but that particular kind of cluster of personality features. You can see hints of narcissism, antisocialness, and that strategic, ruthlessness in combination. And it seems to what both makes them very successful. And it sometimes leads to their disasters,
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. It's not necessarily terrible. I mean, I have some friends who are ruthlessly beat me at board games and video games and stuff, and they've clearly got some of these traits when we're playing, I feel like, but they're not out to harm anybody. But on the other hand, maybe they shouldn't be in charge of the world. Anyway, and you talk about an awful lot of people in the book, and you're welcome to talk about whoever you want. One of the two figures in particular, though, that you mentioned have a lot. Have a big role in some of the episodes for my show, the Conquest of the Americas, and I haven't really talked about them a whole lot. And but I have mentioned the Spanish Habsburg dynasty a little bit. But would you tell us who is the person in history known as Joanna the Mad, and why is she important to history?
So she is probably the most consequential queen that you've never heard of, essentially, in a way, in that she is the daughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. So she basically is the first woman who unites the houses of Castile and Aragon into what becomes properly a united Spain. Now, of course, Isabella and Ferdinand get most of the credit, but their union came through their marriage. So each of them still remain technically the monarch of either Castile or Aragon. With their daughter Joanna, both houses meet in one individual. So she becomes sort of like the first proper, if you will, queen of a technically united Spanish empire. She also has the fortune of marrying a fellow named Philip the Handsome, which sort of describes his most prominent feature, apparently, was a prince of the Austrian house of Habsburg. So she also basically, I'm saying she as if she had initiative in doing all this. She didn't.
Yes.
I didn't actually hear of her, but she basically ends up uniting Spain and Austria, and you end up with this massive Habsburg empire that spans, Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy. There was like a superpower in its day. Unfortunately, she also was severely mentally ill, and in her late teens and early 20s, she began to experience, according to the historical record at least, a lot of symptoms that look like some kind of psychosis. Now, whether she has schizoaffective disorder or bipolar, it's hard to narrow it down to specifically what she seems to have been experiencing. But it looks like in her late teens or early 20s, about the time she married Philip, she develops this psychosis, which led to her having lots of issues with obsessiveness, paranoia, anxiety, depression. She really was just a mess, essentially. Yeah. She was highly devoted to her husband, loved him literally to death, in the sense that once he died pretty young. He died fairly soon after their marriage. She would not let him be buried. So she would go to his tomb.
Wow, yeah.
And so just some unusual behaviors. So what ends up happening is, while Isabella is alive, her mother, Isabella tries to take care of her. Isabella kind of comes through history as a very sort of a difficult woman, but it does look like she tried her best to take care of Joanna while Isabella was still alive. But once Isabella dies, Joanna's kind of, doesn't really have a protector any longer. And as a consequence, first her father, Ferdinand, and then her son, Carlos, basically sort of move her aside and place her in an asylum. And so she is entirely cut off of power, and first her father and then her son end up ruling in her place, either as regent or, in the case of her son, eventually as co-monarch, or eventually he becomes a Holy Roman Emperor. So, so there's some kind of conspiracy theories around her that sometimes suggest maybe she wasn't really that mentally ill, and maybe Ferdinand and Carlos just kind of shoved her aside, or Charles just kind of shoved her aside. But the reality seems to be that probably she had a significant mental illness, and it's possible that her father and son in various ways took advantage of that. But the likelihood is that she really did have some pretty severe issues that she was experiencing.
Right. Yeah. And well, And the Habsburg dynasty stays in power for Spain for so long. And you talk a little bit about, and this is a great example about how, madness and genetics kind of intertwine. And at the other end of this of the Habsburg dynasty, we have somebody named Charles II. And and he's a descendant, I guess, of Joanna. But who is he, and what happens when Charles here gets in charge? I guess in the 1655 is what I have.
Yeah. So she is I'm trying to think what level of great grandson, but basically he is a descendant of Joanna. So the funny thing is that the Habsburgs in Austria had probably some genetic issues, in that once they're married into the Spanish house, then the Spanish Habsburgs also acquire some of those genetic limitations. So what happens is back then is people kind of evolved this idea of like royal blood as being pure. And the unfortunate part of that aspect is that then begins to break down some barriers to incest. If you believe that royal blood is pure, then you shouldn't mix it with non-royal blood, right? But that means that the gene pool of people you can, marry and produce kids with becomes very limited. So it became very customary for people to marry their first cousins during that time period, which you can get away with to a limited extent. But if you do it generation after generation and there's a genetic mutation in there, then that increases the frequency of those genetic mutations and makes them worse. So the most prominent example is sometimes called the Habsburg Jaw. So you sometimes hear about the very protruding lower jaw that both the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs even had. Even Marie Antoinette, who is a Habsburg, was supposed to have had some minor variant of the Habsburg jaw that gave her kind of a pouting lip and such. But it was usually worse in the males than in the females. And because of that inbreeding that continued over generations, it ends up getting progressively worse. That the Spanish Habsburgs always had the jaw, and they always tended to be prone to melancholy. There weren't really any happy Spanish Habsburgs that I could recall through history. All of the very powerful kings that you read about, Charles and the various Philips, all were not happy campers. And it ends basically with Charles II, who is born with significant physical and cognitive disabilities. Essentially, he doesn't talk until the age of 4. He never showed sort of proper cognitive development. There are some debates about the degree of his cognitive impairment, but it seems pretty clear he had at least some degree of cognitive impairment. He also has severe physical limitations. He wasn't expected to live through childhood. He had issues with his digestive tract. He was thought to have been impotent. And just a whole host of medical and psychological issues. He doesn't seem to have been a bad guy, so he seems kind of fairly simple, just kind of wanted to do his own thing, play with his toys, go play in the garden. He loved his first wife in particular, dearly, but he just wasn't suited to be a king, and he had the problem with the jaw. It was so bad for him. He had difficulty talking and swallowing because the jaw was so badly malformed. Unfortunately for Spain, he ended up ruling at a period where Spain was under a lot of strain. So their empire was beginning to contract, not geographically yet so much, but economically it was starting to struggle. And they were always at war with particularly France, but also the Netherlands and England. And so they were in a bad military position. They were in a bad financial position. They really needed to update their military traditions and stuff. They needed a strong ruler, and they ended up with Charles II, who is not a bad guy, but just, was not the person they needed for that time period. And also because of his difficulty with his sexual functioning, he doesn't have any heirs. So when he dies, and I forget his age exactly, he died in early to mid-adulthood. It ends up causing a crisis in European politics because he ends up naming, I think it was a nephew of Louis XIV, a French Bourbon king, as his successor, which totally upsets the balance of power in Europe and leads to the War of the Spanish Succession, which is the end of Spain as a leading power in Europe and the rise of England as a leading power in Europe. So it pretty much ends the Spanish Empire as a thing that people care about for the most part, other than piracy So
Right.
the English love it to grab gold from them, but other than that, as a really influential power, Spain is clearly on the decline from that point on. They putter on for a couple more centuries until the U.S. puts them out of their misery with the Spanish-American War in the late 1800s.
Oh yeah, no, that's. Thank you for getting into that. Thank you. That's great. Now, one other thing you get into the book, you have different chapters on different types of madness or how madness can enter. Different chapters. Don't let me talk. But one is about madness in religion, and I thought that one was interesting because you talked a little bit about a concept called about how. Probably different kinds of madness, but religious madness is one of these. That how, we're really worried that Hitler or Stalin or Mao is going to crawl out of the woodwork. But I guess the reality is a lot of times the madness is really just personally destructive. And I thought that, in particular, one example I could think of that I just got into was how. At a time when Christopher Columbus needed to show the same kind of leadership, I guess, that Charles II wasn't able to if he wanted to get his goal of controlling as much of the New World as possible, he sent a letter back to Ferdinand and Isabella saying that he had discovered the Garden of Eden. And I mean, even in the about 1492, I can't imagine that he really. If he'd have sat down and thought that through, that with a clear mind, that would have been a good thing to write back. But anyway, could you just, I guess, get into that idea about, I guess, personally destructive madness or religious madness, or a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, so first off, it's important to point out that religion can be a very positive part of people's lives. So it's not, trying to disparage all religion or organized religion or whatever else. It's like everything else. Like in a certain balance, it can be positive, and if it's taken to an extreme, it can either be personally destructive or can be destructive to other individuals. Of course, if we're sticking with the Spanish example, Isabella in particular and Ferdinand to a lesser extent, were very pious individuals, but in a very, very rigid and destructive way. So you hear a lot about like the treatment of the Jews and the Moors or the Muslims in Spain, which was incredibly ruthless. But to particularly to Isabella, that was part of her, religious agenda, was to Christianize the entirety of Spain. So Columbus probably was playing, not successfully, but probably playing to some of that a little bit in his Isabella. It wasn't successful. They eventually figured out he was kind of a nutter, but so you can see that kind of destructiveness to others. Sometimes it's used as an excuse. So we have to be a little bit cautious with that. So sometimes like conflicts over resources may be guised under, we're doing it for religious purposes, when it's really something. What's that Machiavellianism again, right? Something other than religion, but religion is used as a cover. So we have to sometimes be wary of always blaming religion for every conflict that has a religious overtone. But you can get into this sort of sense of like religion sometimes being a personally destructive thing if taken too far. So there's this idea that people will indulge or engage in activities that are rewarding for one reason or another, but we always need to maintain a balance with those activities. And religion is just like any other. That it can be a rewarding thing. It can be very social. It can make us feel better about ourselves. It can help us during stressful times. But if we indulge in it too much, it can begin to interfere with our social relationships. It can interfere with our health or our finances and such. And so there are these, excellent examples of various martyrs, or saints throughout history that engaged in, asceticism, where basically is the sort of mortification of the flesh, where they're literally in some cases starving themselves to death, or in other ways engaging in unhygienic practices because they believe it's going to bring them closer to God. I think it was Saint Margaret, for instance, who never washed her hair purposely to get lice in order to which for most of us is like, just
to suffer.
I get where you're going with it, but so there are issues like that. And of course, Saint Catherine, who basically starved herself to death that was what she believed she had to do in order to be fully in touch with God and such. But it doesn't have to be something quite as extreme like that. Essentially we see this, and again, on the other hand, you do see these like dark triad people take advantage of it, that people will sometimes on a much smaller level donate money they don't have, to religious faiths. And that's where, again, sometimes you have oysters who are taking advantage of that, So like everything else, religion has to maintain a certain balance, and we're making sure that we're not, despite what some of the, language might be, that we're not totally sacrificing our lives in this world. I don't think we need to do that. I don't think most faiths say that we need to do that. There may be a few very ascetic faiths that say we do, but most faiths I don't say we have to like kill ourselves in this life to, be successful in the next, whatever that may mean. But rather we need to find a certain amount of balance between, finding ways to spiritually grow without necessarily having that impact negatively on our health, on our mental health, on our financial situation, or in the way that we treat other people, so that if you look at the way like, Christianity, particularly in the New Testament, I'm not a Bible scholar, so I'm not going to, I could not, I'll just make up verses essentially. God wants us to eat more chocolate. But at least in my, certainly non-expert reading of the New Testament, it's a very loving text for the most part. It really is about trying to understand others and not judging but you can see where people will sometimes distort religious messages in order to hate others, to be negative towards others. And in that sense, you're probably adding more negativity into the world. And I think there's some value in stopping and considering, am I really adhering to the messages of my faith if I'm making other people miserable? And is that really what Christ wants me to do? Or is it really what Muhammad wants me to do, or Buddha, or whoever, the spiritual leader of the faith is? And I think in most cases we would find, and all faiths are guilty of this. You can find
no, absolutely,
sewer militants, which is weird in a way when you think of even our stereotypes of Buddhism as being very peaceful. But Buddha didn't say to go out and kill non-Buddhists, and Christ didn't go out, say go out and kill, non-Christians and stuff. And so sometimes we can get wound up in our religious beliefs. We can distort what those religious beliefs actually are. And then we can also become very ideological. So our religious beliefs can cut us off from other sources of information. That's not unique to religion. You can see this sometimes with certain, social ideologies as well. I mean, both, far right conservatism and far left progressivism get criticized. But at the extreme, you hear at least, occasionally anecdotes of parents who don't bring their sick children into the doctor because their faith says they should pray, and then the child dies, and so, my argument there would be, I certainly don't mean any disrespect to people that follow different faiths, but, you do want to be kind of open to other sources of information from science and things like that. If you're completely closed off to that, we can see examples like this where individuals themselves don't seek medical care they should get, or they don't seek it for their children, and clearly that is causing destructiveness to themselves or to their families. And that's where we may want to think of, like, how can we balance this maybe a little bit better?
Okay. Oh, yeah. Awesome. Now, you've got a couple more chapters I want to talk about, and one madness on the commune and another madness of the 1%, which seem to me like they almost, you kind of hinted there's almost a relationship there. And I want to say I personally agreed with a lot of what you wrote. And real briefly, I'm a very, very, very left-leaning, I guess, myself. And I remember in college, for whatever history class it was, I had to read the Communist Manifesto. And I realized kind of you get into this, there was no, I was kind of expecting like almost like a constitution or something, this is how we'll run the dictatorship. And it's not what it was. And but it seems to me, I guess what you're getting at is that the kind of situation where people would be so angry that they're wanting to overthrow the status quo, like a real revolution, isn't necessarily going to end up in someone, say, like Bernie Sanders being in charge. That would maybe just be a great way for someone with those dark triad tendencies maybe to slide in. And You talk about whatever you want with this, but does this, I guess, does this leave us kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place? Are we destined to be ruled by madness? I guess. No matter what, is there a way out of this or whatever?
Sometimes, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, first off, it's funny because I even right now with the election coming up, I see these like various memes on Facebook and Twitter, and we're ready for a revolution. So I was like. Okay, so first off, most revolutions fail. Right. So you understand like the odds of getting what you want. So either most revolutions fail or they end up in something worse than the thing you started with. So the American Revolution was weird in that it actually kind of succeeded and kind of got what the people, at least the people that sort of initiated it, wanted.
Right.
Strange. That is an outlier revolution. Most revolutions are either crushed, or if they do succeed, they end up with something totally different than what most of their supporters imagined. You can look at like the French Revolution of 1789, and of course the Russian Revolution, various Russian revolutions right around the Bolsheviks taking power. Neither of these resulted in anything better than what they starting off with, and even the like I forget the exact word for it, but the Arab Spring of just about 10 years ago, for instance, most of those revolutions were crushed. I think Tunisia looks better than it did beforehand, but most of the other countries either ended up with a different authoritarian regime or just didn't change. Basically the revolution was smashed before it got anywhere. So yeah, you have to be a little bit cautious saying like, so I mean, like in the United States, we may disagree with a lot of things that are happening, and I don't necessarily like our current government myself, but you have to kind of take some stock of what we have, that we have the freedom to criticize our government. Most of us have a television and a DVD player, and most of us can get access to healthcare. Some can't, and I understand that, and that is something that would be great if we could fix. But things aren't that bad. They could be better, but they're not super, super bad. And if you create a revolution, there's a small chance you might get something better. There's a much bigger chance worse than where you started from. That's always the case with revolutions. You have to kind of say, okay, granted, if you're in like Russia in like 1917, it might be worth it. If you're in the U.S. in 2020, I don't know if a revolution is what we want. We want change, maybe, but working within the system is probably going to be more productive than changing it entirely. I mean, the thing with communism is funny, right? Because even today, like People's Republic of China, there are people that love the PRC, like in the West, will make apologies for Mao. And still think like with COVID-19, the PRC is doing great. So you get these kind of like weird apologies about communism in China. It was and remains an incredibly repressive and authoritarian regime. Communism sucks. It's just like, other than like Nazism, it's hard to think. I mean, I would take an absolute monarchy over monarchs, but there's some that are not bad.
Yeah.
No good. I can't think of an actual communist government that wasn't horrible. They're like uniformly terrible. It's difficult to find. I mean, probably maybe like modern Vietnam might be as close as you can kind of get, but. But yeah, communism has got a terrible, terrible track record. So it's kind of funny when you see people that are, tempted to try it.
Right.
Like, I mean, socialism is weird, right? Socialism is so ill-defined that it means different things, Mark, right? The Denmarkian system is not socialism the way that like Marx and Engels thought of socialism. It's really kind of like a take a bunch of money and toss it around, to everybody, so kind of like levels a playing field. It's capitalism with a softer edge, if you will. It's not anything like what socialism was envisioned by Marx or Engels. But other regimes like Venezuela are also socialism that's probably closer to the Marx Engels sort of approach to it. We don't want that. And again, that sort of system really doesn't work very well. So people, when they call for socialism, should be very specific. We want Denmark, is what we want. And we can still debate whether better off with a Denmarkian system or not. But we want Denmarkian socialism, not Venezuelan socialism. And those are very different systems. But it is kind of funny, So with communism, people kind of think that there's this everybody's holding hands in a circle, singing songs and sharing. It's like the John Lennon song "Imagine" is song, and I don't think anybody wants to live in the world of John Lennon's "Imagine" if they really thought about it. But there has never been a variant of communism that has worked out where everybody is equal. Once Leninism crept in, so there was always a sense of communism was going to be violent, right? So even the Communist Manifesto has this aggressive edge to it. It's not like a peaceful friendly home. It's not very long. It's very easy to read, so people don't for it. But it's an aggressive book, so it starts off with this sort of sense of aggression. It definitely is us versus them. It's really the foundation of the whole idea. But there is this sense of particularly when it starts into Leninism, once Lenin gets control of it, there's a sense of people are idiots, right? Which is probably right. And I include myself among the idiots, by the way. So Lenin kind of people are basically stupid. The masses are idiots, and you need the common sort of guide everything. And this is where we starting probably common law more as an oligarchy, So once we get and the idea that a certain group of elites have to lead the masses, and that only this group of very ideological elites, they have to pass certain litmus tests to be considered, and even once you're in the party, they get paranoid about each other, and you end up with the Leninists and the Trotskyists and the Stalinists and all kinds of other stuff. But it is a sort of leadership by authoritarian regime, which is an invitation to corruption and to brutality, which is why I think we've seen such a terrible track record of negative outcomes for communist regimes. I mean, to their credit, the PRC are in a much better economic place than China was under Mao's regime. But even today, people are like, why can't we do with COVID-19 what the PRC are done in Wuhan? And you see the videos of what happens to people? They ass kicking and screaming and stuff. It works, but it's still not how I think most of us would want to live,
Right.
We really gave it some thought. So, and I kind of made this point in the book that we had to get communism is terrible, any other system and give that a shot first. Maybe other than Nazi Germany, but other than that, try an absolute monarchy. You might have a terrible outcome, but you might not have a bad outcome. You will always have a bad outcome with communism.
Yeah. I agree with you. It seems like the Communist Manifesto is very angry, and it's not like a plan, really. It's more like this is why we're being communists, not this is how this is going to work good. It's more like and then you just end up with, now we're, instead of whoever the old dictator was, or there's a new dictator. And anyway, okay. Speaking of modern politics, one thing, you kind of put me at ease a little bit with a chapter I think you have, or a topic you have on dementia, because it's to me, I'm not an expert at all, but I would have told you that there's Trump on television or something 10 years ago, and then today, that there's nobody with more dementia than him except for Joe Biden. And that's not something that makes you feel good, but you make an argument that dementia is not something that we should be frightened about, like maybe some other madnesses, or put us at ease. Tell us that this election isn't going to be the last election that we're just all going to drift away into incoherence, I guess.
It's not going to be the end of the United States. I can make that prediction. We will have another election in 2024. Who knows who will be? I won't try to predict the election this cycle.
I don't. I wouldn't ask you to do that. But
my guess is as good as anybody. So the good news about dementia. I mean, we do have examples of rulers in history who have clearly had dementia. We've had presidents who have, we've had at least one who clearly had dementia, and we have one who people suspect had dementia. And those are Woodrow Wilson, who had a stroke in office, and whose wife and physician and chief of staff largely ran the country in his place in the last year or so of his presidency.
Wow, yeah.
Ronald Reagan, who many people suspect had early Alzheimer's. He was diagnosed once he left office, a few years after he left office, but a lot of people suspect he probably had prodromal or early Alzheimer's in his last years in office. And there's evidence that sort of back that up. It's not unequivocal, but analysis of speech, for instance, suggests his speech pattern starting to resemble people that are in the early stages of Alzheimer's and stuff in his last years of office. So we've had the experience of at least one, maybe two presidents who have had dementia. And certainly we've seen other rulers, through time who have had dementia. The good news about dementia is that it doesn't usually cause rulers to become like psychopaths. Massacres have not been created by rulers who had dementia. So the idea that a ruler with dementia is going to like launch at the red button and launch missiles into Russia or something like that. No, that's probably not going to happen. So it's what tends to happen with rulers who have dementia is that they just lose track of everything that's going on. So if you look at like the presidency, the good news about the U.S. government, and again, I'm not a political scientist, but my experience with just like looking at through history is that it tends to run pretty good. And the Roman Empire was very similar in this respect. It tends to run pretty good bureaucratically, no matter who's in charge. So you could put a raccoon in the presidency, and the government would kind of hum along, and we would still pay our taxes, and still complain about the president, although he might look better than some of the other ones we've had. I don't know, depending on perspective. And so what's what people call like the deep state, and it's made to sound like a terrible thing, but reality kind of keeps everything humming along. The idea of the presidency is to try to keep everything organized. And what can happen is when you have a president who doesn't set the agenda very well anymore, is you can end up with, allegedly at least, what happened with the Reagan presidency, that he started to lose. Again, if we buy the narrative that he had early Alzheimer's, that he began to lose a sense of what his underlings were doing, and that led to something like an Iran-Contra, affair. When he testified about that, he basically said he didn't know what they were doing, and I kind of believe him. That's entirely plausible that he did not know what they were doing, or only had half an idea of what they were doing, and that perhaps without strong guidance, some of his subordinates took it upon themselves to do things that were not a great idea in that particular situation. So, fortunately, with a strong bureaucracy, you can sometimes see the bureaucracy move in and kind of take control. And even if mistakes are made or things look a bit chaotic, it mostly keeps things humming along. So if you look at like the Roman Empire, which had a very strong bureaucracy, they went through generations of terrible emperors and still managed to hold themselves together. So for centuries of a pretty bad track record of emperors. They had some good ones, but they had a lot of bad ones. Survive. And so I think the United States has a lot of similarities with the Roman Empire, but that is one. And that it's not technically an empire, of course, but even as a republic, it is kind of capable along the democratic space, no matter how terrible the president may be. I don't want to like challenge the president, in a sense of like proving me wrong, and so I won't say it's impossible for a president to completely upend, the U.S.'s position in the world. But generally speaking, we've had in recent history, and people may have different opinions about which ones count, but we've had some pretty terrible presidents in recent history. I'm not even necessarily talking about the current incumbent, and we've survived it, And so I think that whether you like or don't like Trump or like or don't like Biden, the presidency or the U.S. will at least survive whoever is next. Now, as to the question, are Trump or Biden demented? Do they have dementia? I mean, obviously, I don't know. I mean, I think most strong. So first off, whichever one gets elected is going to be the oldest president in U.S. history, which is by a non-trivial amount. So that's kind of fascinating to consider. And one thing that's important to point out is that some degree of cognitive declines are natural. So by the time that people are in their late 70s, as both Trump and Biden are, we would expect them to have some difficulties with like memory and processing speed, learning new tasks and stuff like that. On the other hand, they might accumulate wisdom, experience, and patience and things like that. So there are some benefits to aging as well. I don't want to make it sound like it's all terrible. But it's funny because my mother, who's 79, keeps joking, and she has early Alzheimer's. She keeps joking that she should run for president if Joe Biden can, because why not? So when we analyze people's speech, from 10 years ago to today, it's sort of normal to see some declines in people's speech, at that age. So we can't say that necessarily is dementia. I think it's probably true with Trump and Biden. You could show that their speeches decline. People showed it pretty clearly with George W. Bush as well. His speech declined over time. But that's the question becomes, have the particular markers of Alzheimer's disease. And I'm not a linguist, so I'm not off the top of my head familiar with exactly what those markers are. But there are certain markers that linguists can look for to identify if someone has early Alzheimer's, for instance, and that would be kind of intriguing. And that's what was done with Reagan, some of his speeches in the end of his presidency. It would be kind of intriguing to look at these individuals and see, do they speak in a way that the people who have early Alzheimer's tend to speak, and that could be an indication of experiencing some dementia. Now, with President Trump, I think probably to the extent that he has been challenging as a president, I don't think that has to do with dementia. I think that has to do with more of his personality. I think he was pretty upfront, to his credit, with who he was. He gave us what was on the box. He was not a surprise, but he is a fragile, narcissistic bomb thrower. Whether you think that's a feature or a bug is depends upon where you sit, politically. He may be what you wanted in the president. So you got exactly the bomb thrower, destroyer of everything that you hoped for, and on the other hand, if that wasn't what you were looking for, then he may seem like the worst president, ever. I think it's impossible to judge in the moment how history will judge any president, and people have very strong emotions about a current president. But historically, 20, 30, 100 years, we'll have we'll all be dead, but somebody will have a clear sense of where he fits in the ranking of presidencies. But same thing with of course the concerns come up with Joe Biden about his cognitive abilities and whether they're in decline, more so than you would expect given his age. Perhaps I actually met him. He probably I don't think he would remember, but I met him briefly about 10 years, maybe not quite 10 years ago. In a meeting he held about video games and stuff. They're politicians. So if you're looking for a non-narcissistic politician, good luck. They're all, they all have some degree of that dark triad. It's just degrees. They're all narcissists. Most of them are narcissists at the very least. So I think Trump tends to come across as perhaps what we call more fragile narcissist, in the sense that he, has difficulty with criticism. He always has to punch back, kind of stuff. Now, some people want him to do that, and some people don't. Some people think it's non-presidential. But Joe Biden seems to be a bit more, controlled, at least historically, he was a bit more controlled. Are they experiencing cognitive declines because of their age? Almost certainly. We all are going to by the time we're in our late 70s. Are they experiencing dementia? We really don't know. And there may be ways of finding out if we study that in terms of how their speech patterns. And we'll see how they do, over the next 8 to 10 years, I guess, which is too late for us to decide if we want to be president. But that's kind of what happened with Reagan during the time. People didn't really think he had Alzheimer's disease. It now looks like there's at least a strong chance, not definitive, that he may have had early Alzheimer's in the last years of his presidency. So, but yeah, either way, if Trump is reelected, we'll get 4 more years of the same, whether you like that or don't like that as an individual choice. If we end up electing Biden, we'll probably have 4 more years that look kind of similar to the Obama years, I guess. And even if one of these individuals or both go off to their dotage somewhere in the middle of their presidency, probably things we won't notice to a large degree, because their subordinates will kind of move in and control things and manage them as best they can until the next election. The idea that we're going to use, I forget which amendment it is in the Constitution, it's 26 or something like that, I don't remember. But there's an amendment in the Constitution, for removing a president when they're no longer capable. Nobody's ever going to use that. I would be shocked, that if anybody ever uses that in our lifetime.
Yeah.
So I don't think, even if it had dementia, that you would see their own cabinet throw them under the bus and their presidency using that mechanism. It would take something very, very severe.
Yeah.
Have like flu or schizophrenia or something like that for that to really kick in. Dementia probably won't do it.
Right. Okay. Well, you have one last question or topic I want to get into is you have a chapter, Madness of the Masses. Mm-hmm. And that might be the most, I think, important thing for people to consider for all sorts of reasons. I mean, even just like myself, I'm completely addicted to my phone. I know it. Yeah. Everyone else is. I know it can't be good for me. And someone, mentioned something like, if there was a drug that you ate or smoked that made you stare at your hand for 5 minutes every hour for 12 hours a day, we would be seriously concerned for the children. But but not just that. Obviously, very topically, I'll be, I guess, probably uploading this tomorrow morning. But we're dealing with coronavirus and I guess social distancing and everything, and feeling a little isolated. And so I guess probably we're all feeling a little mad. And in your book, you mentioned that you have a brief aside, I guess, about how every once in a while a crazy person wanders into your room and you have to talk to them for 10 or 15 minutes. So talk to everybody out here where we are all the crazy people wandering in your office. Dr. Chris Ferguson, help us. Do you have any advice to help us deal with the current madness that we are living through?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually with those, and I think I mentioned in the book, because we're a psychology department and we have an open campus, sometimes individuals would act as schizophrenia will wander into campus, and they always send to the psychology department. I don't know.
Of course they would, I guess. Yeah, I thought that was pretty funny.
Usually these individuals are harmless, and so I usually just say, hey, look, I can give you 20 minutes. You can talk about what usually is the Bible. So you can talk about the Bible if you want for 20 minutes. I'll listen, and then I got to get back to work. So that's usually kind of. So I'll do that with the public as well. I can hear you for 20 minutes, and then I got to get back to the No, I'm teasing, of course.
And I want to be clear. I'm not trying to make anybody show up to your office. I apologize if that happens.
We're all on lockdown now, anyway. So I ain't.
Right.
So I mean, we kind of go back to Lenin, and if Lenin had lots of terrible ideas, but one thing he was right about was kind of this idea that people are basically idiots, right? And like I said, I include myself in that, and what that means. So taking it out of the context of communism, what that kind of means is that we mostly make decisions emotionally, not intellectually. Sometimes we do, but usually we make these kind of like gut decisions that are based on how we feel. And the problem is that causes us to make a lot of bad decisions. Making decisions upon how you feel. You can probably relate to this in a relationship, and that relationship wasn't going very well, and your head is telling you to get out of the relationship, but your heart says that you're in love with them and that you want to try it. And usually you go with your heart, and you're wrong, right? You know what I mean? So usually your head was telling you the actual thing that you should have been listening to. So that makes the case that we're bad at making database decisions. And that's kind of why the original framers of the Constitution built it the way that it is. That people complain about the Electoral College and other elements of our Republican system that aren't exactly democratic. And they did that for a reason, because if you try a full-blown democracy, you end up with ancient Athens, which was a disaster. You want some blocks between people's emotion and decision making, and that works up to an extent. So if you look at like how people make decisions about something like, say, global warming, like, so global warming is obviously being eclipsed at the moment by this whole like COVID-19 thing, but it's probably like one of the big issues that we're going to face over the next couple of generations, right? But how people make a decision about whether they believe it's a thing or not is usually not data-based. And people pick on conservatives mostly for this, right? It's people who are sort of denying that global warming is real, it's a conspiracy or whatever. But the research suggests that liberals or Democrats or progressives are just as bad, actually, and that they believe in global warming not because they know anything about it, because it's what Democrats do, and Republicans don't believe in global warming because that's what Republicans do. And so what you end up with is like every issue of importance ends up being tribalized. So you look at like COVID-19, people on the left think we should be socially distancing and shutting down the economy because that's what Democrats are supposed to think. And people on the conservative, I'm generalizing, of course, but people on the right are more likely to say, well, the economy is more important. Grandparents everywhere are welcome, or to take one for the team. Which making this up. These things
right? Yeah.
Said this. I think they should actually survey grandparents first before making that claim. But the left does it too. So like you look at like gender issues. So the whole idea like gender is a social construction is false. Our gender identity resides in the hypothalamus of our brain. So people who are on the left tend to sort of ignore that science because it fits. That's what people on the left do. That's what their tribe believes. So it's kind of like religion. People will ignore evidence that doesn't fit with their worldviews, and do so in ways that sort of place them in these groups, and then they hate the other group of people that have a different idea. So you're either like a literal like Nazi or a literal communist, depending on who you disagree with. And the problem over the last maybe like 10 to 15 years. Well, there are some problems that have been built into the structure of U.S. politics, but also like social media has amplified this stuff. So two issues that kind of amplify these problems are, one, in the U.S. we have this primary system, which is terrible and has a lot of problems. And the unfortunate thing about the primary system is that it incentivizes the craziest people. Most of us have jobs and families and hobbies and things we need to do that make us reluctant to bother to, it's not great, but are. So the average person doesn't tend to vote in primaries as often as crazy people, and like I in the most general, I'm not trying to offend anybody or that kind of stuff, but there's not in a mental health sense, but just in terms of people who have very extreme views of how the world works, tend to be the ones who are motivated to vote in primaries. Those are exactly the people we don't want making decisions for the country, and that's why you end up seeing candidates very often, veering to the far left and the far right, with these extreme viewpoints, because they're appealing to the, maddest people, if you will, to use the book's terms, who are going to vote in primary elections. And you end up with the possibility that someone like, Bernie Sanders, who I think was a good faith individual, had a lot of good ideas, but was pretty extreme. My guess, if I was going to guess about the election in 2020, is that he probably stood far less a chance of actually being elected than Joe Biden, but because he was so far from most people in the voting public. But he was a serious candidate. In the primary, people had to, people were inclined to be sympathetic to his worldview because they also were more extreme voters in the primary. Now, granted, Trump himself is, of course, very extreme in opposing ways. So you end up with two extreme candidates. Who the hell knows what's going to happen there? But so the primary system is kind of a problem because you end up with this sense that the maddest people end up picking the two candidates that we get to vote between. And then for those of us, maybe I am mad. I don't know. But for those people, maybe I shouldn't include myself in there. But for the people in the middle, the people that are less mad, at very least, they end up with two horrible candidates, right? Who they don't like. time. And that's a kind of a problem for our voting system. The other thing that's been more of a recent challenge over the last 10 to 15 years, of course, is social media, where social media is wonderful. It's got a lot of benefits to us. That's lovely. I use it, but of course it also amplifies, and probably Twitter is the worst of all of them. It sort of amplifies the most extreme viewpoints and further tribalizes people. So there's this issue. So if you ever try to have a nuanced debate about abortion, and so that's actually an issue I don't really care that much about. I don't have a strong opinion, and so I have said sometimes I can see both sides' arguments, and I see merit to both. And you end up being a literal sexist, misogynist, woman hater, and baby killer at the same time. Right. You didn't endorse fully either side's extreme views of how the world should work. And so I think that you can get this weird quasi censorship almost of moderate or nuanced views that emerges through systems like that. So like I said, I'm on Twitter. I use it, but I sometimes kid that Twitter is this dark hole of human, social interaction and such, because of its tendency to be incredibly unforgiving about stupid things. I mean, there are these toxic environments over young adult novels, or knitting. Apparently, is something where there's extreme, narratives of knitting. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
How are you a fascist knitter? I don't know, but that's what happens. And so you end up with these structures that end up, incentivizing the most extreme, angry, maddest voices, if you will. And because they're so extreme and angry and have this platform now, they can shout down and disincentivize most of us who don't want to be bothered. We don't have the stomach to end up in that kind of mud fight with a bunch of mad people. It's not worth it. It's abusive. We don't feel that strongly about whatever the issue is. We don't want to be called a fascist, communist, baby killer. I don't know, whatever the thing of the day, may end up being. And I think that ends up causing a problem for our discourse, if you will, and that it cuts down in our ability to compromise. It cuts down on our ability to see the viewpoints or respect the viewpoints of others who feel differently from us, even if we disagree with them. And it ends up causing gridlock. So unless one party ends up with a supermajority, we can't do anything. And granted, our government was kind of built that way on purpose to some extent, but it becomes hard to on global warming. It's just the more you say that the right are evil, fascist, oil-loving, world-killing monsters, the less they're going to want to work with you. And same thing, the more that you say that the left is this conspiracy, evil, fraud, that kind of stuff, they're not going to want to work with you. Nobody listens more because you call them an asshole, right? That doesn't incentivize people to hear you anymore. But it's, again, emotionally, it's tempting. That's virtue. We like to make ourselves look virtuous at the expense of other individuals, and that signals to our group how we have adhered to the ideology or the identity of our group. And in the moment, it's very, very satisfying. Unfortunately, it's completely unpragmatic and completely unpractical, and doesn't lead to any kind of actual change or positivity in the world. The most you can hope for is that your group assumes total control, in which, again, you have some sort of ideological authoritarian regime. Which generally doesn't work either. It ends up a disaster in most cases. So we want a plurality of views. We want compromise. We want people to work together. And unfortunately, the way things have kind of evolved, both politically and socially, in part through social media, I don't want to blame everything on Twitter, has ended up causing this incentive structure where the loudest, maddest people have at very least outsized voices. And that makes it difficult for more moderate voices to be heard. And in my own field, academia is as bad as anybody, to be honest, and that's something I think we need to really look at and change, and maybe dial things back to the 70s or 80s. I hate to be one of these people saying my day was much better, but it definitely is something that kind of took off from the 90s and got worse in the 21st century. So we could kind of dial it back a little bit God forbid, the Reagan years. And so, at least they were able to compromise on something and get something done. Lost the ability, to do that, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Well, anyway, I think one really great way that people can do a better job of trying to hear out arguments and listen to people is to read books. Chris, I don't want to keep you too long. I guess we've been talking for probably maybe about an hour, a little longer. I have really enjoyed speaking with you, and I very much enjoyed the book. Once again, it is How Madness Shapes History, and the author is Dr. Chris Ferguson. Thanks very much for taking the time and for speaking to my audience. Any other books or projects you want to talk about before I let you go?
Yeah, sure. So first off, it was awesome being on. I had a lot of fun. I really appreciate the time that you took to talk with me today. As far as other books, I got two other ones that people might want to read. I hope they want to read. So I have one other nonfiction book that's called Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong, which is kind of just, again, what it says on the box. So it's actually about video game research. That's actually my primary area. It's actually doing research on video games. So it talks a little bit about that. But again, it's kind of fun, and I try to tell jokes in there as well. Although we also talk about like mass shootings and all kinds of other salacious things. So I don't make jokes about them, but the jokes and the horrible stories are separated from each other. And then I also have a novel, Suicide Kings, which is a mystery novel with a female protagonist that's set in 15th century Florence. So if you want a little bit of from all the serious science and history stuff, that's kind of I liked it,
Yeah.
So
Oh, awesome.
I would read it, So hopefully people will get interested in checking a couple of those out as well.
Awesome. Once again, thank you very much, and you have a great day. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Chris.
Same here. Take care. Have a good day.
Okay, I'm gonna.
Listen what I say. The captain is a tyrant and I no longer obey. I'm sick of taking orders from the madman in command. So let's drop him on an island and leave him in the sand. Cause it's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. It's a mutiny. And now we're taking over the ship. What's happening here? You're no longer in control, and we're drinking up your beer. This is now a democratic, egalitarian pirate ship. So enjoy your trip, 'cause it's a mutiny.